Our story today starts with Judah's sixth king, King Asa. At this point, for the kingdom of Judah, they have survived the overthrow of Saul's dynasty, the overbearing and oppressive reigns of David and Solomon, the heart-wrenching split of Israel into two rival kingdoms, and the persistent brutal warring between these two kingdoms of Judah and Israel. And it is here that King Asa enters the scene. And the author of 1 King writes that King Asa brought reformation to the land, refocusing and grounding the nation into the divine and bringing peace to their people. He expelled shrine prostitutes, rid the nation of idols, even removed the queen mother, who was either his mother or grandmother, from power due to her promotion of Asherah, a pagan goddess. And all was well. The author of 1 Kings writes that King Asa's heart was true to the Lord all of his days. Or, as the Jewish Tanakh states it, and I love this, King Asa was wholehearted with the Lord, his God, all his life. And after decades of conflict, oppression, uncertainty, I can almost feel the kingdom of Judah's bodily sigh of relief. Finally, we are at rest. But not for long. Soon, King Baasha of the kingdom of Israel went up against Judah and built Ramah to prevent anyone from going out or coming in to King Asa of Judah. These movements against Judah, fortifying cities, moving troops, all pointed to war. And King Asa, observing all of this, had his alarm bells go off. Warning, warning, danger ahead. And so, King Asa came up with a plan. He ordered his officials to gather all of the gold and silver stored in the treasury of the temple and the royal palace. And he instructed all of his officials, not all of his officials, some officials, to take all of that gold and silver to the Aramean king, King Ben-Hadad, with this message. Let there be an alliance between me and you, like that between my father and your father. I am sending you a present of silver and gold. Go, break your alliance with King Baasha of Israel so that he may withdraw from me. Well, I imagine King Ben-Hadad awed by the amount of treasure before him. Kind of like a cartoon with giant gold coins rotating where his eyes should have been. And so King Ben-Hadad, struck by all of this gold and all of this silver, breaks his alliance with King Baasha of Israel, partners with King Asa of Judah, and attacks Israel from the north. Well, King Baasha, whose troops were in the south preparing to attack Judah, had to rush his troops up to the north to defend their territory, abandoning their posts and supplies in the south. And while Israel was distracted defending their territory up north, King Asa ordered his troops to steal all of the supplies that the Israel army abandoned, build up cities, and reclaim parts of the territory that Israel had captured. And with that, the kingdom seems to be at rest. And the author of 1 Kings finishes Asa's story. Now the rest of all of the acts of Asa, all his power, all that he did, and the cities he built, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? But, he continues before ending, in his old age he was diseased in his feet, and then he says that Asa slept with his ancestors and was buried with his ancestors in the city of his father David. A reign of 41 years, the longest reigning king up until this point. And honestly, Asa sounds like a great guy. He inspired religious reform. He refocused Judah's attention on the divine rather than idols of wood and stone. He cleverly found a way to avoid a years-long war with his Israel rivals. He created and strengthened alliances with neighboring kingdoms. I mean, Other than being afflicted with a foot disease, Asa's reign is remembered for being one that brought peace to the kingdom and security and thriving for the people of Judah. I mean, what a great guy. Well, 200 years after this story was first written, the chronicler takes it upon himself to rewrite the stories of Judah's kings all over again. Now, just as 1 Kings, the chronicler begins very much the same way by saying, after Abijah, Asa begins his reign, and Asa did what was good and right in the sight of the Lord his God. He details how Asa brings about reform and how the people prospered and the Lord gave him peace. But then the chronicler inserts a couple of stories that are very much absent from 1 Kings. The first begins as Zerah the Ethiopian advances on Asa and Judah with a vast army of 1 million fighting men and 300 horse-drawn chariots, nearly doubling Asa's 580,000 fighting men and chariots of 0. Asa, overcome by the sheer volume of his opponents, cries out to God, "O Lord, there is no difference for you between helping the mighty and the weak. Help us, Lord, our God, for we rely on you, and in your name we have come against this multitude. O Lord, you are God. Let no mortal prevail against you." And the chronicler states, the Lord defeated the Ethiopians before Asa and before Judah, and the Ethiopians fled. Now, soon after, a lay prophet, Azariah, met Asa and said, "Hear me, Asa, and all Judah and Benjamin. The Lord is with you while you are with him. If you seek him, you will be found. He will be found by you, but if you abandon him, he will abandon you." And for a long time, Israel was without the true God and without a teaching priest and without law. But when in their distress, they turned to the Lord, the God of Israel, sought him. And he was found by them. In those times, it was not safe for anyone to go or come, for great disturbance afflicted all the inhabitants of the lands. They were broken in pieces, nation against nation, and city against city, for God troubled them with every sort of distress. But you take courage. Do not let your hand be weak, for your work shall be rewarded. And Asa, moved by such a proclamation, institutes religious reform yet again. And from these two stories, the chronicler's message is clear. Rely on God, and God will save you from your enemies, no matter how vast they are. Rely on God, and God will be with you. Don't rely on God? Well, you're screwed, because God will abandon you. But then, and we're familiar with this story, King Baasha of Israel makes preparations to attack Judah. Asa, looking to defend Judah, takes gold and silver from the palace and temple and entices the king of Aram, Ben-Hadad, to break alliance with Israel and instead partner with him. And through this alliance, King Asa effectively stops war between Israel and Judah for the duration of his life. But here's the kicker. The chronicler, clearly unhappy with this, shares the story of another prophet, Hanani the seer, which there is no picture of, and so I'm changing the picture with just a little circle with Hanani in the middle. Hanani, the seer, approaches Asa and harshly scolds him. "Because you relied on the king of Aram and did not rely on the Lord your God, the army of the king of Aram has escaped you. Were not the Ethiopians and the Libyans a huge army with exceedingly many chariots and cavalry? Yet because you relied on the Lord, he gave them into your hand. For the eyes of the Lord range throughout the entire earth, to strengthen those whose hearts is true to him. You have done foolishly in this, and from now on, you will have wars. But here's the thing. There's no mention of more wars or conflicts. Asa and Judah are seemingly at peace for the rest of Asa's reign. The chronicler continues 2 years before the death of Asa, in the 39th year of his reign. Asa was diseased in his feet, and his disease became severe. Yet even in his disease, he did not seek the Lord, but sought help from physicians. And then Asa dies. A great celebration was given in his honor. And the end. And oh boy, yet again, the Chronicles version is such a different story. In 1 Kings, Asa is a king who was celebrated as one who lived his entire life wholeheartedly for God. But in Chronicles, Asa may have started out that way, but the chronicler makes it very clear that to him, Asa failed miserably by the end of his life. And I have to be honest, I find myself viscerally reacting to the chronicler and his version of Asa's story. To my husband's utter annoyance, my constant refrain for the last month has been, I hate the chronicler. I mean, who is the chronicler to decide hundreds of years after the events occurred and 200 years after the story is written down that Asa acted in opposition to faith? I mean, just take a look at the chronicler's reasoning. Asa aligned with a foreign king, a decision that brought years of peace and prosperity to the people of Judah. And because history doesn't record Asa publicly consulting the religious institution before making the decision, the chronicler declares that this is an act of zero faith. Or take the moment Asa, the poor guy, was afflicted with a terrible, excruciating foot disease and consulted physicians for help. And again, because history doesn't record Asa publicly consulting the religious institution or praying for God's assistance, the chronicler declares this again as another act of failed faith. And this accusation of failed and zero faith feels deeply unfair to me. Unfair because honestly, both acts seem to be guided by wisdom. Wisdom in making a decision that stopped war, saved lives, and brought peace. Wisdom in seeking help from the experts in a field that they know better than you. And before you say it, yes, I know medicine back then was wonky. But that doesn't negate the fact that for Asa and his illness, those physicians were the best resource he had, and he wisely relied on their expertise. And the more I think about Asa's wise choices, and the more I think about the chronicler's condemnation of Asa acting on that wisdom, the more I get frustrated with just a few sprinkles of anger. You see, this feels like religious manipulation. And it turns out I'm actually not alone in this. Jewish Chronicles expert Dr. David Rothstein says that rabbinic tradition clearly indicates awareness of the numerous differences between Chronicles and its sources, and tends to view Chronicles as a kind of midrash, or commentary. Or, in a more severe way, one early Renaissance rabbi, Isaac Abravanel, went as far to describe Chronicles as comparable to the politically motivated treatises of monarchies. And that's exactly what this version of the chronicler's story is. It is politically motivated religious propaganda. You trusted your wisdom, which proves you didn't have enough faith that God would save you from a war in Israel, and now you're cursed. You trusted the wisdom of physicians to bring you relief rather than have faith that God could heal you, and now you're cursed. And it just gives me the heebie-jeebies. It feels icky. The chronicler, in an attempt to promote the religious institution, wants Asa to cast aside wisdom in favor of faith in God only. And in this act, the chronicler is making a statement. Faith in God is diametrically opposed to the wisdom of this world. And too often, religious institutions and leaders do this. They push faith, 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 and more faith while casting suspicion and contempt on the wisdom of this world. And we see this today. And one of the most common and sneakiest ways that I see this happening is through those not of this world stickers that you see everywhere. Cars, water bottles, clothing, you name it. And if you haven't seen them everywhere, now that I've mentioned it, you will begin to see them everywhere. And the confession. Every time I see these not of the world stickers, I give a hard eye roll. Why? Because, well, it's a phrase that comes from the Bible, directly from Jesus' lips, in fact. The phrase not of this world has been used to perpetuate the harmful idea that unless it comes from the Bible, it is a sin. It creates a false dichotomy. Bible, good. World, bad. This means that discoveries and developments like science, history, psychology are censured. Movements of equality are condemned, and creative expressions of all sorts are denounced as anti-God. And in the process of maintaining that faith is somehow opposed to wisdom, Christians end up alienating and condemning brilliant people, movements, and advances that are advocating and bringing about peace, healing, and goodness for all, simply because they weren't attained by God alone. And here's the thing. Here's the thing that these people and the chronicler fail to recognize. Faith without wisdom has dire consequences. Faith without wisdom is dangerous. And I want to name 3 dangers of practicing faith without wisdom. The first, faith without wisdom leads to a practice of superstition. Let me just take a moment and explain. When I worked in the hospital, there was a patient who needed a life-saving amputation. But his wife was adamant that he should refuse this amputation. Nothing the doctors, nurses, psychologists, or rest of the staff said could convince her to change her opinion. And so they asked for a hospital chaplain to visit. As it was on my unit, I headed up and I entered the room. The patient was lying on his bed, barely cognizant. And laying on his bed, standing next to the bed, his wife stood anxiously, holding his hand, clearly desperate. And I knocked on the wall and I said, "Hi, I'm Mandy. I'm the chaplain on this unit. I just wanted to stop by and check and see how you were doing." And her story flooded out, in and out of the hospital, back and forth, doctors, nurses, infection, amputation, and a deep inner wrestling and angst that boiled down to this fear that if she allowed the doctors to amputate, it meant she didn't have faith in God. And her resolve honestly struck me. And I asked, "Have you experienced this before? Have you been in a place where you relied on faith alone when someone you loved was sick?" "Yes," she said. "A few years ago, my friend was diagnosed with terminal cancer. All of our friends were scared," she said, "but I knew better. My friend believed in God. My friend had faith. I believed in God. I had faith. She's going to be okay. God would heal her." Well, she got worse and worse, and all the while her friends were scared. She says, "I wasn't nervous. I was happy. God would perform an even bigger miracle and heal her. I believed that," she said, "until the day she died." Tears began to well up in her eyes and her voice choked, and she said, "I sometimes wonder if I'm making the same mistake now." And the room was heavy with her confession. And I said, the only thing I could think of, "I'm so sorry, that's devastating." And she nodded. I asked, "Can I ask, what if faith looks like trusting that God's wisdom and love shows up in the advice given to you by the doctors and nurses?" And she responded, I've wondered that. But how can it be faith if we give in to the disease? And I responded, or maybe you're stopping the disease. And it was like flipping a switch. Her body tensed. You can almost see the wall being built brick by brick as she shut me out. No. I have faith. God will heal him. I wish I could tell you what ended up happening. I left shortly after, and I never found out. I think of her often, though. She had so much wisdom. She had the wisdom of so many medical professionals, surgeons, doctors, nurses, psychologists, all saying that this is the best way forward, but still, she insisted that to follow the wisdom of the medical staff would have been to fail in her faith of God. And while maybe not in such an extreme, I see this often in the Christian world. We have to say just the right things, do just the right things, believe just the right things to keep God on our side. It's honestly almost like a potion or a spell designed to appease or trick the divine into accepting our pleas. And friends, that's not a healthy relationship. That's fear-driven superstition. And that's what happens when faith is maintained without wisdom. Our relationship with the divine is morphed into a practice of superstition. Number 2, faith without wisdom ceases to grow and learn. At my previous church, our services were divided into 2, a traditional worship service and a contemporary worship service. Now, one Sabbath morning, we decided to combine all of our services together, which admittedly never went well because someone was always unhappy. But this particular morning, we decided to do something a little different. The band attempted jazz renditions of the worship music. Now, I don't know how well it was pulled off, but it was unique, and it was something different, and it was a pretty cool experiment. Well, one elderly woman, bless her heart, was deeply, deeply disturbed. She approached a few days after the service and was like, Mandy, what was that? And I responded, that was worship music. And she said, oh, no. That was not worship music. And I responded, well, we sang praise to God. We sang about the divine. That sounds pretty much like worship music to me. And we launched into this conversation. It became very clear by the end of it that the presence of the drums, the beat of the music, and the unique jazz chords all confirmed in her mind that this was not Christian. And this is the problem. Faith without wisdom ceases to grow and learn and adapt and change. It ceases to recognize that what this world appreciates, celebrates, and creates is going to be different 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 30 years, 100 years from now. And faith without wisdom looks at this change, and rather than celebrating, growing, and adapting with it, it looks at it with terror. And how tragic. Because faith is supposed to be this beautiful, blossoming, life-giving thing, but without wisdom, it becomes brittle and unforgiving. Growing up, my mom used to say this phrase repeatedly. If your faith is the same now as it was last year, then you've missed something. And I love that. I love that because it recognizes that wisdom is a crucial ingredient for a blossoming faith. And number 3, faith without wisdom denies God's partnership with humanity. From the very beginning, we see God's purposeful and continual movement to be with humanity more fully, choosing to partner with humanity to embody and to teach divine love. In Genesis, God partners with humanity to cherish and care for this beautiful planet with all of her creatures and plants and landscapes and life. In Exodus, God partners with humanity to rescue and liberate an entire people oppressed and enslaved by a great and terrible kingdom. In the writings of the prophets, God partners with humanity to call for restoration, to call for the care of the widow, the orphan, the alien, the poor. In the gospel, God partners with humanity by becoming human, walking, living, eating, dreaming, and working alongside us. And in the rest of the New Testament and through to today, God partners with humanity by giving us a purpose to embody the love of the divine and to empower others to do the same. God's entire movement throughout history has been one towards and with humanity. It's almost as if when God created humanity and took a look at us and said, dang, humanity is very good. It's almost like she meant it, huh? And this is why it's so harmful to have faith without wisdom. To ignore the wisdom of this world in favor of faith only is to deny the fact that faith becomes powerful, life-changing, and restoring when we use it in partnership with the human experience, wisdom, and story. So what does faith hand in hand with wisdom look like? Faith with wisdom looks like love. It's a reflection on childhood theology, a recognition that it has some growing to do before it more fully reflects Jesus' love. It's an arm of comfort around a heartbroken and discouraged loved one. It's an admittance of wrongdoing and a genuine, humble, I'm sorry. It's a practice of gratitude and appreciation for the beauty, kindness, and humanity that stubbornly and persistently fills this world even when darkness tries to overcome. All of this was embodied for me this past Tuesday evening. For the last 4 weeks, our Paradox kids have been in our anti-racist kids series. And during this series, we're learning through the Bible stories, through historical stories, what it means to recognize and celebrate differences, what racism is, and learning how to actively stand up for equality, justice, and love as followers of Jesus. Our conversations on Saturday morning have been both heavy and heartbreaking and also enlightening, inspiring, and occasionally entertaining because, from the mouths of babes and all that. But on a Tuesday evening, as about 15 parents met over Zoom to talk about this series, it was never more clear to me that the real work is being done by our Paradox families at home. Through activities and discussions that are provided for our families each week, as well as their own conversations about current events and reading diverse and insightful children's books, as well as their own personal education, these parents are neck deep in conversations with their kiddos about what it means to be anti-racist today. And as the 15 of us met that evening, you could sense, even through the computer screen, the emotional energy of the space was heavy, tired, and discouraged. And then one parent spoke up and said in so many words, I want to empower my kids, but what if I'm not doing it right? I'm scared I'm doing this wrong. Does anyone else feel this way? And one after the other. Oh, I feel that. Me too. Oh yeah, I definitely feel that way. And all the heaviness melted away and the air was lighter. And it was easier to breathe because we realized I'm not alone in this. I have this whole community who's in this with me. And for the next hour and a half, we shared stories. Stories of the kiddos saying the darnest things. Stories of kids speaking truth in the raw and blunt ways we wish we could sometimes. Stories of our mess-ups. Stories of our successes. Stories of sadness and discouragement, stories of humor and joy. We laughed, we cried, we connected over our dreams and fears, our hopes and worries, and our deep desire to empower our kids to stand up for justice and embody the love of our God. And it was beautiful. As one person said, I am comforted knowing that there's this whole group of wise adults who my kids get to grow up with. When faith and wisdom join hand in hand, it looks like this. It looks like holding space for emotions. It looks like cherishing stories. It looks like encouraging and empowering each other on the road of divine love and justice. It looks like vulnerability, courage, and honesty. It looks like community grounded in faith, growing in wisdom, and embodying love. So yeah, the chronicler got it wrong. Faith in God alone, only by itself, without wisdom, without the relationship, the growth, the human divine partnership, it's not enough. It's not nearly powerful enough. God chose to partner with humanity because she knows that when faith works together with our stories, our experiences, our wisdom, our desire for a better, more beautiful world, she knows that there is nothing more powerful, nothing more life-changing, nothing more holy than that love that is poured into this world. Today, may we, grounded in faith, honor and embrace the wisdom of our communities, and in doing so, embody and pour out the love of Jesus Christ for all. Amen.